Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here this month. We have the honor to have Dr. Ravi as our speaker for Grace Series. Dr. Ravi is a professor of computer science at the University of Texas at Dallas. His area of teaching and research include wireless and sensor networking, mobile computing, multimedia streaming, and distributed computing. He received multiple research grants from federal agency and industry, including the NSF Career Award and the NSF Major Research Infrastructure Award. He has served the technical and university community in his roles as an editor of the IEEE transaction on mobile computing, as the president of IEEE Dallas section, technical program committee, chair and vice chair of various conferences, and as the speaker of the UT Dallas Faculty Senate. He received his bachelor from India and his master and PhD from the Ohio State University. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And it is indeed my pleasure to speak in front of all of you. I am going to deviate a little bit from the talks in the sense that talks that you heard in the series, in the sense that this is not necessarily going to be a technical talk. It's going to be about the more important underlying core values that we should be refreshing and being reminded of in academia under the present circumstances. And it's always good to be reminded of these values from time to time. So fostering the culture of excellence, which we often tend to forget. And the subtitle of my presentation will become clearer as we go along. So my mouse doesn't work anymore. Okay. This is interesting.
So I think Michelle is sharing, yes?
No, I'm sharing the screen here. Yeah, it's not working here. And this is not a touch display, so I don't know what's happening.
Maybe close it and.
Somebody has a mouse or something, maybe can extend the mouse.
What mission is the?
I mean, she got I can share it for you too.
If you can, you have it. So should I just stop sharing? Gone completely off. Okay, something happened. It worked, but I don't know whether it'll work again. Okay, it seems to work. All right. Okay, so let's start with a. Yes. Okay, all right. So it's thank you for inviting me to this presentation. And this talk is not necessarily going to be talking about technical issues, but it's a presentation to you about some of the core values that should guide us in our academic work, some values that need to be, we all need to be reminded of from time to time. So the whole idea is about fostering excellence. Now, before I go into what's happening today and what we should be doing today, let's just quickly preview history a little bit. So let's go back to 19th century Prussia, which is basically the precursor of modern Germany. And there was this person called Wilhelm von Humboldt and his brother Alexander Humboldt. And they made a profound impact on higher education in Prussia at that time. If you know history, The major powers at that time were, of course, the Habsburg Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, France, Russia, England. Russia was not really a big power, and it was trying to grow. And one of the approaches they took was by improving their position in science and technology and education. So Wilhelm Humboldt, who was an advisor to the Kaiser, basically said that what people in Prussia needed was higher education guided by the values of enlightenment. And the goal there was not to train students in vocational studies to become artisans, but to train students to become autonomous individuals and world citizens. So that's a pretty high goal. Uh, and basically the whole idea was that up until now, the universities were primarily teaching people or schools. This was the universities will not only be teaching people, but will also be engines of research and innovation. For 19th century Europe, that was indeed a revolutionary idea. And the whole idea was because the goal was to take guidance for enlightenment, education should be based on logic and reason and empirical data analysis and things of that sort, which form the basis of our scientific research anyway. And interestingly enough, up until then, educational institutions primarily existed on patronage from kings and other wealthy people. And they bowed to whatever the people in authority said. Wilhelm Humboldt said that if universities are to prosper, they should have some form of independence from the ruler. And the way they should do that is you provide funds, let them thrive, but do not manage their operations. Keep a separation from the funding to the operations. And that his whole idea was that would give academic freedom to universities. And he wasn't really trying to separate between academic freedom for universities versus faculty versus students, but the whole idea was academic freedom for universities to pursue what they think are the most important issues to be pursued. Now, remember that around that same time, the French education system was extremely different. It is said that a French minister of education said that just by looking at his watch, he could tell which word in which line of Virgil's poem were the students in French education system underlining at that point of time all across the French colonies and France. It was a highly centralized, controlled, regimented education system in France. And what these people were imagining was a highly decentralized and free exercise in teaching and research. So just contrast this with what was being practiced in one of the superpowers, next door superpowers at that time. Now, if you look at what was happening in the 19th century, well, then in the 19th century, what happened in the US? To a great extent, our modern US university system is a direct descendant of the German university system. In 1862, we had the Model Act, which basically said we'll create land grant universities. Universities will be given land, which they will sell to raise money, or they will license and to people who graze cattle and things of that sort, and based on the revenue generated will run the university. So universities will get state land and then will operate based on the revenue generated. Now, of course, who that land belonged to and all that stuff is a very different story that I don't have time to go into, and you can look that up. And if you look at this map, pretty much every Big Ten university is a product of that act. Cornell University is a product of that act. So most of these were state universities, but Cornell and a few others are private universities that also came out of this. And you can look at that map and you can find all that stuff. So and then what happened is that in addition to liberal arts agriculture, mining, all those kinds of things were also being taught. Military engineering. So Texas A&M University, you can understand now where the name comes from, agriculture and mining. And then the Hatch Act was passed in 1887, which added agricultural experiment stations at universities. Now, you don't have to travel too far at Quite Road to see the Texas A&M Agriculture Experiment Station. So that's kind of a descendant of those same ideas. Those of you who live on McCallum are quite familiar with that building, right where McCallum meets Coit. And then what happened is, especially in the southern states, these universities, even though they were funded by the federal government, were not open to African American students. There was racial segregation. So the Second Morrill Act, 1890, funded the establishment of new colleges for African American students, and those colleges then grew into what are current HBCUs. So that is the idea of the state providing funds, and then universities would not be directly controlled by the state. Instead, each university system will have a board of regents that will, in a way, autonomously govern this. In a state like Texas, those regents are appointed by the governor. In a state like Michigan, those regents are actually elected on a statewide ballot. So they may be independent of the governor and the legislature. So different states have slightly different bodies. But the whole underlying idea was this funded by the state, but not directly a state agency. And now we come to early 20th century, and American universities, both state universities as well as private universities, were involved in this great debate. What should we be teaching? And because there was a significant amount of British influence still in America, education debate was around what was being done at Oxford and Cambridge and those kinds of places. And the idea was, in the Western civilization, there are great books. And these books have enduring value because they speak about very important issues. And should be part of the curriculum. The great books, the classics, because they talk about lasting values. At the same time, students should be taught liberal arts education. Now, when we say liberal arts, remember that you go back 2,500 years, liberal arts included astronomy and mathematics. So liberal arts wasn't just humanities at that time, and equestrian as well. Because the whole idea was, if you're making a citizen, the citizen should know all these things. Science and mathematics and astronomy and equestrian and literature and poetry and everything, right? So, and just like today, when there is a tension between industry and the university as to what should be taught in the university, the industry wants us to teach people immediate vocational skills. If they are computer science students, they will say, teach them this tool so that when they come here, they can directly start developing code for us. And we in the university say, well, in 6 months, that tool will be obsolete. And then what will they do? Because you will lay them off. So the emphasis even then was students should learn to learn for a lifetime. And the picture that you see here is that of Robert Maynard Hutchins. This person was an interesting person in the sense that he became the dean of the Yale Law School at the age of 30. And within a couple of years, he was appointed the president of the University of Chicago. And then he stayed there for about 20 some years, and then became the head of the Ford Foundation, and really transformed higher education. And what University of Chicago is today is to a great extent due to what he did. Of course, some of you may not like his views on a variety of things. The prevailing view is that University of Chicago is a place where fun goes to die. Well, he said that fun, fraternities, and football have no place in a university. They are there to entertain people who should not be at the university in the first place. So he had some pretty strong views, but he also really developed University of Chicago into what it is today. Um, he was also a person who was a very strong advocate for interdisciplinary studies and research. And he saw the siloing and the specialization that started happening at University of Chicago at that time. And he lamented that when he looks at the university, he feels that it's just a collection of independent buildings connected together by a common HVAC system. Now remember, this is the person who was president of Chicago when Manhattan Project was going on, and people like Enrico Fermi and all were at University of Chicago. In the basement, the ground below the football stadium was where the lab was. So, uh, so there is a fair amount of work that he did. So as I was talking to you earlier, there's always been an uneasy relationship between the universities, the government, and the sections of the society. Uh, and it's due to a variety of reasons. And I would say it's not just universities, but scholarship and government and society. There's always been a little bit of a tension. That tension could be partially due to religious issues, because sometimes one of my friends said, isn't it interesting that science, with advancement in science, God is becoming less and less powerful? Because the powers that we attributed to God are now explained away as natural phenomena. So, and the church said the earth was the center of the universe and the sun revolved around the earth. And then when Galileo said that's not the case, it's not a Helios, if the sun is at the center, he was, of course, persecuted by the church, right? So from time to time, universities and scholars have done these kinds of things that have challenged religion. Similarly, there are social norms. When you put some very smart people together, smart and young people together, who are away from their home for the very first time, they start experimenting with how they would like society to be. And the older people like us sometimes do not find that very comfortable. In terms of inclusion versus exclusion, equality versus inequality, and so on and so forth. So generational and social conflicts often arise at universities. And you will notice that a lot of political conflicts have also arisen at universities. If you remember the Vietnam War and the protests against the war, or the civil rights movement, and the university students participating in it, and university students on the summer breaks coming from universities in the north to the south to register people to vote and those kinds of things, right? So there's always been that kind of tension as well. And there's also been tension within the scientific community. If you are an established scientist and you think you have the answer to all the world, here comes a younger scientist who says, no, you're wrong. So there's also been a tension within the university. And having been educated partially in India and then coming to the US, I found something very interesting and refreshing in the US education system, which was, first of all, when my professors had called me by my first name, it took me a while to get used to that. But then it was not just calling them by the first name. It was basically, look, in a community of scholars, we talk as equals. And you should feel free to challenge me if you believe I'm wrong. And I will correct you if I believe you're wrong. And especially in graduate school, we are all trying to solve the same issues, tackle the same problems. And just because the professor has fewer hairs or gray hair doesn't mean that they have a monopoly on knowledge, right? And a very interesting example of that is Linus Pauling. Linus Pauling was at University of California, Berkeley, one of the very few people who has won 2 Nobel Prizes, one in chemistry and one for world peace. Linus Pauling had his own idea about chemical bonds, and he said that the DNA molecule structure should be a triple helix based on his calculations, which were mistaken. And the picture that you see here is that of Rosalind Franklin. She was a researcher in the United Kingdom. She had expertise in X-ray crystallography of molecules. And her X-ray crystallography results showed decisively that the DNA molecule had a double helix structure. And without seeking her consent, her advisor showed those pictures to Watson, who was a postdoc working under Francis Crick, and then Watson and Crick developed the theoretical model of the double helix for which they got the Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, Rosalind Franklin was never the recipient of that prize. But the whole idea is Rosalind Franklin, Watson, and all going against a model proposed by somebody who had already won the Nobel Prize. So the whole idea that established scientists could be wrong, and if you believe you have, and you strongly believe, and the facts are on your side, you need to challenge them. So this tension is within the scientific field and educational field, as well as between this field and the outside world as well. And how to balance that while continuing to good work is always a challenge. So now let's get into something, and I tell all my students, never put paragraphs of text. But what I'm going to read to you are Supreme Court decisions. So there, every word is important. So I would be doing gross injustice if I paraphrase it. If you believe that we live in very interesting times, and we all like to believe that the time in which we are living is the most interesting time, let me just remind you that around 70 years back, the times were no different. In the 1950s, there was a lot of debate about what should professors be doing and what should they not be allowed to do, and what are the kinds of things they should be teaching and for what they should be punished and all that kind of stuff. So what I'm trying to communicate to here is that in the 1950s, Cold War was at its peak. And in the United States, there was a section of people who were really afraid that university professors were indoctrinating young, impressionable students to become communists and to commit acts of treason and sabotage. And so in one particular instance, a faculty member was suspended without pay. In another case, a faculty member was in New York. So that was in New Hampshire. In New York, there's a different case where a faculty member was asked, where all faculty members were asked to take an oath of loyalty and say that they were never a member of the Communist Party. And if they were, they have renounced that and things of that kind. And a faculty member said, I'm not going to take that oath. And I'm not going to tell you whether I was a member of the Communist Party before or not, because that is contrary to the Constitution. And for that, they were fined. So all these things led all the way to the Supreme Court. So here's a decision, Swayze versus New Hampshire, 1957. And I'll read it for you. The essentiality of freedom in the community of American universities is almost self-evident. No one should underestimate the vital role in a democracy that is played by those who guide and train our youth. To impose any straitjacket upon the intellectual leaders in our colleges and universities would imperil the future of our nation. No field of education is so thoroughly comprehended by man that new discoveries cannot yet be made. Particularly is that true in the social sciences, where few, if any, principles are accepted as absolutes. Scholarship cannot flourish in an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust. Now, the money line here. Teachers and students must always remain free to inquire, to study, and to evaluate, to gain new maturity and understanding. Otherwise, our civilization will stagnate and die. This is directly from a Supreme Court decision. And if you read that line, it's basically outlining academic freedom. And I must tell you, academic freedom exists at three levels. Academic freedom is institutional academic freedom, which I talked about through land grant universities and stuff. University has academic freedom. And then within the university, faculty and students both have academic freedom. faculty to teach, and students to learn in an environment that is free of hostility and respectful. So students also have academic freedom, though the legal decisions on that part are relatively sparse, but that's a freedom available to all within the university. And then a few other paragraphs that I would like to read from the same decision. This part was from a concurring opinion written by Justice Felix Frankfurter, a very influential jurist. Prior to becoming a judge of the Supreme Court, he was also a law professor at Harvard Law School. And in his concurring decision, he writes, these pages need not be burdened with proof based on the testimony of a cloud of impressive witnesses of the dependence of a free society on free universities. This means the exclusion of governmental intervention in the intellectual life of a university. It matters little whether such interventions occur avowedly or through actions that inevitably tends to check the ardor and fearlessness of scholars, qualities at once so fragile and so indispensable for fruitful academic labor. And Frankfurter goes on to say, freedom to reason and freedom for disputation on the basis of observation and experiment are the necessary conditions for the advancement of scientific knowledge. A sense of freedom is also necessary for creative work in arts, which equally with scientific research is the concern of the university. And it is the business of a university to provide that atmosphere, which is most conducive to speculation, experiment, and creation. It is an atmosphere in which there prevail the four essential freedoms of a university. This is very important. To determine for itself on academic grounds who may teach. So, hiring of faculty. What may be taught, decision about the curriculum. How it shall be taught, the mode of delivering education, and who may be admitted to study, the admission criteria for students. These are four pillars, and these are enduring pillars. This is a very important part from that decision. So these are the boundaries of pillars of academic freedom. Then there was another decision a few years later, 1967, so 15 years later, and this was the New York State case where some teachers, I believe in Buffalo, refused to take that oath of loyalty, saying that this is contrary to my right to freedom of speech. So this decision is very important because for the very first time, this decision said academic freedom is not something that we are just making up. Academic freedom flows from the First Amendment right to free speech and expression. So academic freedom is a special concern of the First Amendment, which does not tolerate laws that cast a pall of orthodoxy over the classroom. So effectively, it's not something good to have, but it's something that is very important. Now, when you come to academic freedom, then for those of you who have watched the movie Oppenheimer, how many of you have watched the movie Oppenheimer? Okay. Do you remember there was a big debate where the US military types say, we want to limit who gets to work on the project and how documents are distributed. And Oppenheimer and Taylor and other scientists say, no, there should be free exchange of ideas and documents because that's how we work. And if you look at that, Christopher Nolan is basically talking about academic freedom and the tension between government and academic types, because half of them were University of Berkeley professors and University of Chicago professors, right, at that time. So, and this gentleman, Vannevar Bush, he also makes a cameo appearance in that movie because he shows up at Berkeley to fund the research to build the cyclotron that is being built by Livermore. So Vannevar Bush plays a very important role from taking that German model of teaching and research and using that to grow the modern US university. Vannevar Bush himself was a graduate from MIT, I believe, and then later on he went on to teach at MIT. For those of you who keep tabs of local company he went on to establish a company in the 1930s to build a special kind of S tubes to be put in radios. That company was Raytheon. So around the Second World War, the US military relied heavily on universities. So the Manhattan Project was one example, but a lot of other innovations happened at universities that went into building either ammunition or communication equipment or motorized vehicles and those kinds of things at universities. And there was this big debate. So there was this senator, Senator Kilgore from West Virginia, who also was a great advocate for federal funding of university research. And Vannevar Bush was also a big advocate for federal funding of university research. The big difference between the two was that Kilgore said the kind of research that should be done should be decided by bureaucrats and administrators and the public, and all intellectual property generated through federal funding should directly be owned by the government. Vannevar Bush opposed that and said, no, it should be the experts in the field who should decide what kind of work should be funded. The proposal review should be peer reviewed, not reviewed by some bureaucrat. And intellectual property and patents that get generated should belong to the faculty and the university within which they were developed. And that was a very big difference because ultimately Vannevar Bush prevailed and his ideas then led to the creation of the National Science Foundation and the funding of research at universities. Because until then, university research was funded primarily through philanthropic organizations. There was no significant government funding of research. And if you look through history, universities have received federal funding and done research, and the patents that have been created have also significantly enriched universities. Just to give you an idea, we've all consumed Gatorade, right? University of Florida owns intellectual property rights. It has earned a lot. When all of you go buy milk and it says fortified milk, it's fortified with vitamin D. The original patent on that was obtained by University of Wisconsin. Two researchers in food science got that patent. And from that point on till the patent expired, for every carton bottle of fortified milk that was sold, University of Wisconsin got royalties. That amounted to several hundreds of millions of dollars. So research can have a significant impact on the financial independence of universities, which then contributes to academic freedom. So now the question that arises is, how is university research unique? And how is university research and teaching, how are they different from industrial research and teaching? And I will just give you three cases. I'm pretty sure you can think of many more cases. Think of atomic energy and space, medical research, and internet. Did private enterprise invest billions of dollars in atomic energy research right in the very beginning? Or did the government invest that money? And where was that research conducted in the first place? In universities and government research labs. Same with if you look at all the major drugs, the basic scientific research is done in NIH labs and in university labs. Only after the basic scientific properties of those core molecules have been studied, they get picked up by the industry, which then refines it. I'm not trying to belittle industry research, but industry picks up once the fundamental research is done in government labs and universities. And in the case of the internet, the world discovered it in the mid-90s. But packet switch networking research started in 1959 at MIT and UCLA and UC Berkeley. And It continued in government labs and universities without much fanfare for 30 years, 35 years, till suddenly the whole wide world discovered it. It had been around for a long, long time. And the whole idea is, if you look at it, yes, today there are multiple companies that can fire rockets and aspire to send people to the moon and beyond. But for the first 30, 35 years, it was government and NASA and places like Georgia Tech and others that were doing innovative work, and Jet Propulsion Lab along with UCLA and UC Berkeley and MIT that were doing groundbreaking work, right? So the fundamental research has been done at university. So what are the risks involved in fundamental research as we talk about excellence? And how is it different from industry research? So when it comes to industry research, who sets the agenda for industry research? Top level management, which is answerable to shareholders, right? And in that case, how do you justify non-revenue generating work? Because research doesn't generate revenue right off the bat. And if it is your pet project, for how long do you justify that? Compare that with university research. It is all open-ended. And who sets the agenda? It's the individual faculty member in exercising their academic freedom, right? And working with their PhD students in formulating the problems. This seems like an interesting problem. Let me work on it. I don't know whether it will fail or whether it will succeed, but it's a problem worth solving, right? So the question is, if we are in the industry setting, how can you justify spending money and devoting people to work on open problems? If somebody in the industry says, I wish to work on whether P is equal to NP, and I don't know whether we'll be able to solve it or not. Most likely you will be told, we can't fund this. Go find something else to work on. While in a university, you can devote 50 years of your life working on a problem, and you may or may not succeed. So that's the kind of luxury that academic freedom provides to us, right? So imagine now a tenured professor working on an open problem, right? Success, is it guaranteed? That is no. And even if it is guaranteed, we don't know how long it'll take. It may take 2 years, it may take 20 years, it may take an entire career, right? Now, imagine a department head or dean or provost or president at that university. What should they do about such a professor? Should they encourage that professor to continue working on that problem and say, I have your back, even if you don't succeed, as long as you are diligently and honestly working on this? Or should they say, hey, why don't you solve some smaller, simpler problems? What do you think? Yes. You would like them to say that, first one, right? At least in a good academic environment, that's what it should be about, right? That's how you then go for the moonshot. So now imagine a new researcher itching to work on a tough problem, right? Let's talk about a concrete case. This person can get funding because the funding agencies say the problem you're working on is not important, but the person thinks it is important. Is denied tenure, is given a non-tenure track position and then further demoted to an adjunct position and is told to fend for themselves, and their appointment is now semester to semester. Write scientific papers, submits to the top journals in the field, like Nature and Science, and they reject it because they don't think the proposed model, the proposed solution will work. Because the scientific community as a whole is not sure whether the work is effective, whether the solution being presented will work. What should this person do? Continue or give up? Until her work leads to vaccines that save millions of lives. I'm talking about recent history. Dr. Kathleen Carrico, who, along with another researcher at UPenn, basically developed the mRNA vaccine technique that was then administered to people all over the world during COVID-19, for which she got the Nobel Prize in 2023. So that's a moonshot, right? Everybody kept on saying, you will not succeed. She persisted and she did it. Now, of course, the interesting thing is, let's look at these questions. Should she have switched from what she was passionate about to what was in vogue at the time and was well funded? We've all been tempted by that question, right? Did funding agencies cover themselves with glory when they rejected her grant proposals? Now, it's easy to answer in hindsight, but we don't know. They didn't know at that time what was happening. Did highly prestigious peer-reviewed journals make mistakes? Perhaps they did. And basically, that should all tell us that our process is good, but not perfect. We should not rest on our laurels and say the system we have is perfect. No, we should be honest and say we made mistakes. But, and some people do get victimized, enlightened leadership should actually encourage those kinds of risk taking. That's when you get to excellence, right? And once the impact was obvious, of course, all of them are showering praises on her and giving her all kinds of medals and laurels and so on and so forth. And the question that we as researchers should ask, when all these people who were neglecting her and was saying that she was no good, suddenly want to be photographed with her when she's got the Nobel Prize, are they really honoring her work, or are they just trying to bask in her glory? Right? Because once somebody becomes successful, everybody wants to claim credit for that. But those same people were neglecting her when she was doing her work. But the whole idea is excellence requires hard work. Excellence requires persistence, and excellence, people who strive for excellence should be ready for failure and failure and failure and continue to work. Now, it does not guarantee success. You can have a lifetime of failures, but then at least you will have the satisfaction of being honest to yourself and giving it your best shot. While, of course, it is very human to see other people who are successful and sometimes question your own actions, but ultimately you have to do what you think is important for your intellectual satisfaction. So, because this is a computer science talk, there has to be pseudocode, right? So while true, take on tough problems, don't hunger for quick gratification, be prepared for failure, do good and honest work, and learn from failures and successes, and just keep doing, right, forever. Which basically brings us to the opposite side of it. While some people are taking on tough problems and may or may not be able to successfully solve them, which means that they may or may not be able to publish papers about it, there will also be other people who will be lionized around them for writing lots of papers. The question that arises is that worth it? Should scholarship be measured by quality or by quantity? I will tell you, there is a professor at Caltech by the name K. Manichandi. He started his academic career at UT Austin, and he was a keynote speaker at one of the top conferences in my research field. And he said, when he joined UT Austin, a senior professor called him and said, Mani, keep doing good work. But remember one thing, deans don't know how to read, but they sure do know how to count. Which is a sad commentary on the state of academic leadership, right? Where people's research is not judged qualitatively, but quantified by how many papers they've published, how many citations they have received, and so on and so forth. Meaning, on a lighter vein, there's this joke going around, there's been going around for a long, long time, which says God wouldn't have gotten tenure in an American university system. And there are 14 reasons for it. And let me read them out to you. He had only one major publication. Second, it wasn't published in a refereed journal. Third, some even doubt he wrote it himself. Fourth, it may be true he created the world, but what has he done since then? Fifth, his cooperative efforts have been limited. He hasn't worked with any collaborators, right? Sixth, the scientific community has had a hard time replicating his results. Seventh, he never applied to the ethics board for permission to use human subjects, IRB boards. Eighth, when one experiment went awry, he tried to cover it up by drowning the subjects. Ninth, when subjects didn't behave as expected, he deleted them from the sample. Tenth, he rarely came to class, just told students to read the book. 11th, some say he had his son teach the class. He expelled his first 2 students. And although there were only 10 requirements, most of them were hard to satisfy. So the whole idea here is that if you look at this, it's a joke, but it exposes some of the very serious issues with academia, right? Because these are the kinds of arguments you would present when you want to quantify work as opposed to qualify, right? The debate that should be happening in academic circles should not be how many papers you published, but tell me what is your idea. Let's discuss your idea, the strengths and weaknesses, not how many papers you published in the last year, right? If you look at some of the most illustrious novelists, Catcher in the Rye, that was the only novel by that author. But every high schooler reads that today in the United States, right? What has it written since then? Nothing. So quantity should not be lionized, quality should be. And the big problem with emphasizing quantity is now there is so much publication that as a researcher, you don't know what to read and what not to read. So it is at a very high risk that actual quality work will go unnoticed because there's so much noise, it will drown out quality work. So, and that same thing applies to teaching. It's basically any academic exercise. These are rhetorical questions. You all know the answer to that. Is the same course in the same department taught with different levels of effort and rigor? Yes. Right? Do all courses take the same amount of effort to teach? There is no. So when you say a course is a course and your load is 3 courses and the other person's load is 3 courses, it's not an honest comparison. Or 4 or 5 or 8 or 10 or whatever it is, right? Because we are here not making widgets. We are trading in scholarship and knowledge and deep thought. And you cannot quantify that easily, right? This is something that we forget quite often. And when we forget that, we then go into mediocrity. So what we need to do And this is the model that was practiced by the people who established AT&T Bell Labs. And their idea was get the best people you can get. Actually, if you read this, there's also a, mm, a business school professor at Stanford who then left and is now an independent consultant. He's also written a book called Good to Great about uh, Fortune 500 companies that returned 3 times what the S&P 500 returned to their shareholders over a period of 10 years consistently. Only about 10 to 15 companies meet the criteria. And they have exactly the same ethos. First, get the best people you can get. Trust that they are there due to their hunger for knowledge, in the case of business, to develop a product that will change things, right? Get the best people and help them decide what they want to do. Respect their desire to get into uncharted territory. If you just keep doing what everybody's been doing, then you will not hit excellence. You will hit mediocrity. Provide them with resources to explore. Encourage them to take risks. Shield them from fickle administrators who may have other ideas. That's the prescription for excellence. Bean counting is a prescription for media. So with that, I conclude my presentation and thank you. Any questions?
Isn't that
Okay.
point? I first want to thank you so much for being here. I have a tiny little gift
Sure.
as an appreciation. If you go to the chat, there is a um, link.
That's a good question. Okay, let's go to Teams.
Yeah, so right there. If
Yeah.
they can scan that, then you can join the raffle and then you will get prize. We have 3 raffles. So the lucky
Maybe
number
better
is gonna
scan
get
there
it.
because
Yeah.
it's a low resolution screen.
Yeah, maybe it's just a little small, but yeah, they're multiple. So I don't really need this. Thank you again. It was really inspirational, to be honest. I learned a lot just listening to it. And I just forgot to also ask if anybody has any question, please raise your hand so you can ask your question as well.
They're all interested in the raffle right now.
Yeah, after you did the raffle, please ask the question. Anybody have any questions?
Yes. Yes.
Rob, what do you see now, the trend of this academic freedom for the last 10 years and following in the coming 10 years?
So
Are you really going down that aspect or?
I think it is cyclic. In the 50s, lots of faculty members were fired. Some took their firing quietly, but some went all the way to the Supreme Court, right? And they ultimately prevailed. What we're seeing right now is the beginning of the first steps of that part. How that will culminate all the way up, I don't have the ability to predict. But what I'm saying is history has stories of similar nature that we can use for guidance. Yes. Yeah.
I kind of know what your suggestion is, but
Yes.
there are people who join towards the end,
Yeah.
so just.
Meaning, suggestion, meaning, I will just tell you what I try to do. And this is a very personal story. I came to this department, had my 3rd-year review, and then I was called and said, looks like you have a strong record. We want to put you up for tenure the next year, which is 4th year, as opposed to typical 6 years. I was very happy about it, got tenure. And then I decided I was going to work on a problem that was very difficult because that's what tenure should be about. And I had a 5-year project with a professor at EPFL Lausanne. We worked for 5 years and we failed. I had a total of 1 paper on that to show, to put on my resume. Of course, working with other PhD students, I had some other publications as well. But if anybody who was counting looked at it and said, this guy got tenure and he went to sleep. But I was working, I was trying to solve a problem, and it was very humbling to know that the problem defeated, right? But when I reflect on that today, I feel that I really took advantage of what tenure was all about. I feel happy about having taken the chance and failed, rather than if I had not done that, today I would have been thinking, what if I had taken the chance? What would have happened? So be prepared for failure, right? Because success isn't guaranteed. If you've constantly been getting success, that means most likely you've been trying to solve only the easier problems. You haven't taken on a problem that was harder than your own abilities. And I'm not saying that I'm very smart. There are people who are way smarter than I am, right? So different people will achieve success at different levels, right? What is very hard for me may come very easily to somebody who's much smarter than I am, much more accomplished than I am. But within my limitations, I try to do my best, which may not be world beating, but at least I have the satisfaction that I tried, as opposed to saying, I just kind of played the game and got the numbers and just keep quiet for anybody else figures out the tricks I've been playing, right? So at least I have the satisfaction of being honest, and I think I would urge the students to try the same. Yes. Yes.
What's your advice on handling that kind of pressure? Because if you keep on working for a problem for, let's say, a year, then you always have that pressure to finish it as soon as possible and get to next work. So how to handle that pressure, how to tell my advisor, no, I can solve it, maybe I need 3 more years, but slowly I can solve it.
So, okay. The advisor-advisee relationship is a very tricky relationship. It's more often than not, it's like a bad marriage. Um, when I was doing my PhD, I did complete with the same advisor. Um, the poor guy was denied tenure, and I was gleeful when that happened because I didn't have to tell him that I don't want to work with him anymore. So it just happened, but it wasn't going to work out with my first advisor. Now, you should still, meaning ultimately the PhD work is still one big problem. What you're talking about is that problem is made up of 3 or 4 smaller problems. And then you solve them one by one, right? It's not 4 different problems in one PhD, right? And as a PhD student, this is part of your training, right? You take on a problem of a scope that you and your advisor believe can be done in some number of years. And there the responsibility is also on the advisor to nurture you and to help you and things like that, right? Now, of course, taking on the P is equal to any kind of problem as a PhD topic would not necessarily be advisable. But once you get your PhD, you're in academia, you have tenure, that's when you can take those really big. But still, even there, at every stage, try to stretch yourself beyond what you're comfortable at that stage. And the more you stretch, the more your range increases, and then you keep on stretching it. I can understand that there are some advisors who will say, my funding is running out and you have to finish before that. That's an unfortunate state of things, in my opinion. Because then that's not really true combination of. It's like on a clock, you have to get out by this time. That's just my opinion.
At least when you finish PhD, you already have a product to work on, right?
And the other thing is that the other part is that if PhD education is setting people up for more advanced research later, whether in the industry or in academia, a very important aspect of PhD work is something that I try to do with my PhD students is I will help my students, but ultimately the student has to formulate the problem. Because learning how to formulate a problem is something very important. Whether you go into industry later on and you lead a project or you are in academia. I've seen a large number of PhDs who did not formulate the problem were given an already ready problem by their advisor because it was part of a big project. And they did it. And then when they graduated, their resume looked very impressive. But then at the next step of their career, when people relied on them to formulate a new problem, they did not have that training. And they suffered due to it. So formulating a problem is half the game.
So much
I think there's a question here.
Thank you so much for your talk, for your inspiring talk. I do remember when I sent an email to Dr. Ravi to invite him, he asked me about the audience. He told me if the audience are more female, but you can see more. Most of our audience are male students, and thank you so much for everybody being here. I'm very
Please go ahead.
Made on the notion of younger back into memories that one of us likely already go to a fun topic that goes more your passion and then once you get attention, then you can work on so funny.
So once again, meaning every person has to make their own decision, right? A topic is hot for a variety of reasons. Meaning atomic energy research was hot at that time. Just because a topic is hot doesn't mean it's bad, right? Let's not conflate the two. A topic could be hot because there has been a major breakthrough that makes the research in that area much more promising, right? So that could be the reason for it to be hot. Or it could be hot because the federal government said, we're going to put $1 billion in it, right? And sometimes both could be the case. So I'm not saying that we should just reject anything that is hot. That would also be wrong, right? But a person should decide, am I passionate about it? Because ultimately, when things get difficult, it's your passion that actually keeps you engaged and working on the problem. Otherwise, you give up. So. Okay, thank you.